Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in what is the next installment of our SAR Adult Education series. My name is Akiva Block. I teach Gemara here at SAR, and looking forward over the next couple of weeks to studying what I feel to be a very, not only interesting, but really very pertinent, a very timely topic. We're in the political season, and there's a lot being thrown around, mostly platitudes, to be honest with you. But there's a lot being thrown around about economic theory. What should an economy look like? As kind of a follow-up to that, there are all sorts of specific questions that need to be dealt with when dealing with any society. How do you navigate issues of income inequality? How do you navigate questions about healthcare? How do you navigate all sorts of these competition in the marketplace, open markets, a free society? How do we deal with all of these questions? And a halachic society is no different. In a truly halachic society, which, to be frank, we don't have. We live within the framework and the context of secular American society. But in the pristine, pure halachic society, it certainly is. It certainly pays to ask the question. Good afternoon. It certainly pays to ask the question: what should a halachic economic society look like? At the outset, we should point out that these talks and these discussions are completely apolitical. I will not be discussing any particular politician or political party or anything of the like. We're just really interested in studying the sources, knowing what halacha has to say about some of these important questions, and kind of attacking it from that end, rather than kind of the conventional, contemporary political landscape. So that's what I want to do. We're going to begin with a few basic introductory points, and then in future weeks, I think we're going to delve a little bit deeper. We'll just, as an introductory point, we should just note in source number 1, the Talmud teaches us, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Harotze sheyachkim, if a person wants to be wise, Yasok b'dinei mamonot. If a person wants to be wise, what area of study should they engage in? The Talmud says you should engage in dinei mamonot, in monetary matters, in civil law. She'ein locha miktsua b'Torah yoter mehen, because there is no branch, no discipline in the Torah that is more comprehensive, that is greater, if you will, than them. V'hein k'ma'ayan hanovea, they're like a flowing spring. There's really no area of halacha which is more developed, which has been more cultivated, more discussed than dinei mamonot, monetary matters. This is everyday life. We think about keeping Shabbos, we think about keeping kosher, we think about what happens if I mix my fleishik dish with my milchik spoon. All these are important questions, but if you think about it from a day-to-day perspective, the area of life which is most pervasive is issues having to deal with livelihood, with economy, with money, with civil law. Those are really areas which are most pervasive and kind of permeate our entire existence. And therefore, if you really want to be wise, you best study areas having to do with that. And that's what we're going to do. Of course, will we is really the question. By that, you'll see what I mean by that in just a minute. We'll start with this point. Many have made the claim, I'm sure you have heard it at some point in your life. Many have made the claim that Judaism is an inherently socialist religion. I'm sure we've heard people say that at some point throughout the course of our lives. It's often said that Judaism is concerned, of course, and this is true, it's said that Judaism is concerned with caring for the needy, and Judaism seeks to remedy or perhaps even eliminate the differences in income that are regarded as the true cause of poverty. Because the wealthy are often people who are callous or greedy and therefore sometimes undeserving of their wealth, they can't be entrusted with taking care of the poor people in their society the way perhaps they used to be able to. And therefore only a government that acts to improve the conditions of the needy through taxation, redistribution, economic equality, only amongst its citizens, or so the argument goes, can be genuinely considered Jewish. That's what people say. And the truth is that this tendency to think about Judaism equals socialism is not new. Anyone who's familiar with some of the Zionist writings of the 19th century knows that this was really part of the founding of the Zionist movement. If you take a look at the next two sources on the page, Numbers 2 and 3. So the first source is from Moses Hess. Moses Hess was one of the founders of liberal labor Zionism, otherwise known as Socialist Zionism. It was really the left wing of the Zionist movement. Labor Zionism was really the major strand of left-wing Zionism, and it was for many years the most significant tendency in Zionism, much more so than political Zionism, which was much more into kind of navigating the question of Zionism in terms of speaking to world powers and trying to get labor Zionism was much more about moving to Israel, establishing a society. Anyway, so Moses Hess was one of the founders of that movement, and Moses Hess said, in source number 2, Judaism, any trace of haughtiness or aristocracy is foreign to it. The Jewish spirit is a social, democratic spirit down to its very essence, said Moses Hess, who was trained, had a Jewish education as a kid, went to Cheder, and believed that Judaism equals socialism. That's what Moses Hess believed. And Judaism was depicted as a synonym, as a synonym for social justice, equality, and the Jews, who were no strangers to suffering, of course, were the torchbearers of social reform, or so the argument went. You see the same thing from Chaim Arlozorov. We're familiar with Rehov Arlozorov in Yerushalayim. Here you go. You're very welcome. Welcome. Chaim Arlozorov was also an early Zionist thinker. He was assassinated in 1933 while walking the streets of Yerushalayim. As you can tell by the dates on the sheet, he was a very young man. He too writes that the folk socialism of the Jews, the noble spirit of the history of our people, the rule of the ideas of justice and human liberty, and the spiritual development of Judaism, the spiritual quality which the Jews acquired over generations, their cultural consciousness and lofty aspirations for freedom, all these empower them to lead the fight for idealistic socialism. Yes, sir?
One of the problems with this, of course, is the Jewish religion is very ancient, and capitalism is very new. It started in the 1850s and has no literature behind it. But in reality, capitalism is what gives people the best return for their money. Capitalist societies become wealthy, and socialist societies become poor. So we really should look more at capitalism and less at socialism.
Right. So that's thank you for that. That's certainly true. What I would like to argue is that although capitalism, as we know it today, really was thought of or invented relatively recently, that at the very least we can say the Torah and halachic society is really not the socialistic society that is being portrayed here. I'd like to argue that we should just point out before we do so that it's no surprise that the struggle for economic equality was really the pillar of the founding of the Jewish state. Virtually all of the founders of modern Israel were socialists. From Ben Gurion to Golda Meir, these were people who believed in the concept of economic equality, and the Jews, when they found their new state, the worldview was one which had limits in private ownership and very heavy taxation, which was the lifeblood of the new social order in the state of Israel. I'd like to argue that this popular identification of Judaism and social democracy is really a false one, like you were saying. Two central ideas that are the pillars of social redistribution of wealth are the limits on private property and the dream of economic equality. Those are two of the pillars of a socialist society, and I would argue that those two things are alien to Judaism, both in law and in spirit, in both the written and in the oral Torah. And in fact, policies which lead us towards these ends actually hinder and undermine the ideal Jewish society. I'd like to spend some time discussing why I think that is. and then in future weeks get into some of the details on some of these matters. So we're going to spend today talking about, in particular, as you see at the top of the page, the Jewish view of property rights and the accumulation of wealth. In a socialist society, those two things are either limited or non-existent, right? We don't, right? Socialist society very much limits the concept of property rights. You can't really fully ever own something outright, right? It is subject to seizure or to heavy taxation or to those things of the like. And the more you accumulate wealth, the more likely it will be that it will be at some point taken from you and redistributed. Not because anyone, again, we're not impugning any sinister motives on people. We can assume that they're doing so because they want to make, they want to spread the wealth, exactly. They want to, that's, probably, that's, most good-hearted people are after that. But I would like to say that actually a Jewish society, a halachic society, goes in the other direction. And so while there is an emphasis on concern for the needy in Judaism, a very strong emphasis on concern for the needy, of course the Torah tells us that we are enjoined, we're commanded to take care of the stranger and the widow and the orphan. We know that that's true. Through commandments to give charity and other sorts of things. This should not be construed as a limitation on property rights and on accumulation of wealth in the interest of the poor. That's not what these things mean. They mean something else entirely, and I want to talk about exactly what I think they mean and discuss them together with you. It is rare to find in Jewish tradition a call for the restructuring of society or the imposition of economic equality, even as an ideal. Forget about it practically. Even as an ideal, that concept doesn't really exist in classical Jewish sources. That we seek to restructure society in a way where we take from the haves and give to the have-nots. That sort of like global discussion about what a halachic society should look like doesn't really exist. For that matter, the concept of economic theory in general isn't really ever discussed. There are lots of economic laws, right, and details, but the concept of what utopian economic society looks like isn't really discussed so much. And it's rare to find at all a discussion of the restructuring of society. Where we do find a discussion about limits in the accumulation of wealth, limits in property rights, and the concepts of redistribution and a restructuring of society, much more so than in Jewish sources, is in Christian sources. That's really a lot of where we find much more of that. This idea is much more akin to the classic Roman Catholic tradition before the Protestant Reformation, where people's pursuit and accumulation of property and wealth for its own sake was seen as something that was sinful. People's rights to property, they believed, were not absolute. And they were limited by, among other things, the needs of the poor. Right? You can't take more and take more and take more and accumulate more and more and more when there are people who are poor. And therefore, in Roman Catholic society, according to Roman Catholic doctrine, ownership was never really absolute. In the classical Christian view, mankind should not keep more than they absolutely need to live modestly, to have their vocation, to meet their responsibilities. But Judaism takes a very positive view on the accumulation of wealth and of ownership. Judaism respects, as we're going to see, economic success. Judaism respects the idea of accumulation. It sees it as a blessing, so long as it is achieved honestly and used properly. And those are kind of the ideas that I want to develop. And in developing these ideas, I am going to make 3 arguments. Okay? I'm going to make the following 3 arguments. Number 1, I'm going to say that distinct from Christian views, which extol self-denial and oppose excessive wealth, Judaism presents an ideal in which mankind exerts control over the material world in order to realize his divine potential as having been created in God's image. That concept of tselem Elokim, of God's image, looms large in everything that we do. Seeking to channel, to tap into the divine within each of us meant very different things for Christian society and for Jewish society. And we're going to see that borne out in the sources. So that's argument number one, that we're distinct from Christianity, whereas they repress the notion of property rights and excessive wealth. Judaism presents an ideal where we exert control over the material world. The second argument is that this view is reflected in the very specific question of the Jewish approach to property. Property, as far as it's viewed in Judaism, is a right in which individual property ownership is a means of fulfilling man's role in the world. When you have stuff, you can better do what you need in the world, what you're enjoined, what you're charged to do. And third, which is the counterbalance, if that is in fact the case, that in Judaism we believe in property ownership, we embrace it, we understand and we appreciate the accumulation of wealth, if that's the case, how are we to understand the notion of charity? Doesn't charity, our obligation to take care of the less fortunate among us, doesn't that mitigate against everything that I've said up till now? I'd like to suggest that charity, the obligation to care for the poor, I would argue, as the third argument, actually stems from the same responsibility, that same responsibility of actualizing our Tselem Elokim, creates not just a quest for dominion and to accumulate wealth, but actually to take care of others as well. So those are the ideas we're going to develop in our time remaining here today. Yes?
So with this idea of property,
Yeah.
how do you relate that to the Jubilee year, which seems to be the antithesis of that, which says all property is God and it reverts to the original owners. So whatever you accumulate,
Okay, so it's a fair question. It is not entirely, I don't want to say not entirely accurate, but it's certainly an assumption to say that the reason why at the Jubilee year everything goes back to the way it was is because everything really belongs to God. I don't necessarily need to say that, right? And I would also point out that is restricted specifically to land, right? Not to material, not to fungible, movable things, okay? So my bank account doesn't, right, when I make a purchase, it doesn't go back to, it's just property, like real estate, okay? So, but it's a good question about the Jubilee year. Maybe we'll get to it in future weeks. I want to talk a little bit about that then. Yeah, we had another comment over here.
Most of, or all of Jewish generosity really comes from a willingness on the, you're taught.
Beautiful.
A willingness on the part of people to give. And I think that's why the Jews are so generous in all of their philanthropy. Absolutely. We're going to develop that exact point. That's beautiful. I think that's exactly the point. According to that understanding, charity is not about achieving a level playing field. It's not about economic justice. Charity is a moral and religious obligation on the part of the giver, not satisfying a claim on the part of the receiver. I think that's an important distinction to make, and we're going to develop that as we move forward. Very good. So the Jewish concept of, So basically, what this third point we're making is that charity in the Jewish view stems from a completely different understanding of man's role in the world, which is what we're going to get to in just a little bit. In order to appreciate the gulf that separates Jewish economic understanding from the common misperceptions of it. As we pointed out, for centuries, people have been thinking that Judaism is socialism. Let's look very briefly at the idea that guided some Catholic traditions of property, wealth, and charity over the centuries before Protestant Reformation. We're going to go into these sources in just a moment when we get into a discussion about the Jewish conception. But very briefly, just to point out, Christianity's view, as we briefly said a moment ago, Christianity's view of private ownership and the accumulation of wealth is grounded in the theology that rejects man's absolute dominion over worldly things. According to Christianity, mankind doesn't absolutely own anything, right? I don't absolutely own anything. This assumes God's dominion qualifies man's dominion. I don't really own anything. Really, at the end of the day, everything belongs to God. Augustine, the 4th to 5th century Christian theologian, philosopher, very, very influential in the early days of the church. He writes how through the sin of Adam and Eve, mankind lost their control over property and for their own use, and that ultimate ownership from that point on belonged to God. That's how he understood what the sin of Adam and Eve did. So therefore, man's use for stuff is only insofar as it can be used, right? Property rights are not about dominion. When I have something, having it in and of itself is of no significance. The allowance, according to the classical Christian view, the allowance for me to have something, to own something, only exists insofar as I can use it for something meaningful and purposeful, right? By making ownership of property conditional on its proper use, the church fathers created the possibility of the forfeiture of that ownership. If I deem that you are not using your property properly, I can take it from you, right? Because you don't really own it, after all. It's a license to use more than anything else. It follows that the unlimited accumulation of property, according to Christianity, for its own sake, is wrongful. In fact, it's based on this that Augustine, who I pointed out a moment ago, I'm actually going to read a little excerpt. He responds to the Donatist heretics who complain to him that the emperor has seized their property. He's all upset, and what does he say? Since everything can be rightly retained only on the grounds either of divine right, according to which all things belong to God, or of human right, which is in the jurisdiction of the kings of the earth, you are mistaken in calling those things yours which you do not possess. Right? You're wrong, he said. It's not really yours. You're upset that they took it away from you? It's not really yours. According to Christian thought, the creation of private property was a human invention. It was a human invention in order to further one's own, it's an artificial invention of human society to keep the peace. We can't have lawlessness, so we have to create some sort of framework whereby I have what's mine, you have what, but it's not real. It's not absolute. It's not full ownership of anything. And that's what private property and private ownership of things means, according to them. The accumulation of wealth beyond what one needs is something which was sinful. And this idea became more radical as time went on in Christian thought. In medieval times, you had people taking vows of poverty and oaths of celibacy and asceticism, because physical pleasure and benefiting from the world was, in an excessive way, in classical Christian thought, was something which was sinful. This was obviously until the Protestant Reformation. We're not here to discuss Christian history. I'm just using that as a frame of reference for us. So to summarize, in Christian thought, the true ownership of all property really belongs to none other than God himself, and not to people. You look like you have something to say.
I was just saying that the priests were in lieu of God, so they took all the money.
Exactly. That's
self-interest theology.
Yep. So if we were cynical about it, we could certainly make that argument, right? Absolutely. So the priests would continuously seize property from people and wealth, and do it all in the claim of, it really doesn't belong to you, it belongs to God. As far as you're concerned, I'm God's emissary, give it to me. That's kind of how it worked a lot of times. But Judaism alternatively insists that mankind have a profound and powerful impact on the material world, which plays itself out in a vastly, vastly different view of property rights in Judaism. Although you find a little bit, very little bit of an expression of this idea that really all property belongs to God. One example of that, just so you know, is in source number 4. We're going to get back to source number 4 in a little bit. Source number 4 is a comment of the Tur, Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim, who was writing in 14th century Spain. He put together a code of Jewish law called the Tur, the Arba Turim, 4 sections. And in the section dealing with Hilchot Tzedakah, Where he places this and why, we're going to get back to in a little bit. But in the section that deals with Hilchot Tzedakah, in the section that deals with Hilchot Tzedakah, he says, mitzvah, I'm in source number 4. Mitzvah asay litain tzedakah k'fi asaka edo. It's a mitzvah for a person to give tzedakah to the extent that you can. Or we're not going to read the whole section. We're going to get back to middle parts of it in a little bit. But take a look at the end, the last 2 lines. V'al ya'aleh b'libo eitzah lomar. Right? You shouldn't conjure up in your own consciousness the following thought. Eich achaser mamoni litno la'aniyim. Okay? Why would I diminish my own wealth in order to give to a poor person? Why would I do that? Right? Ki yesh lo that you should never entice yourself into saying that. Why? Ki yesh lo ladad, because the person should know she'ein hamamon shelo, because the money is not really his. Ela pikadon, it's rather a pikadon. It's a deposit. It's a charge. Not a loan, but I'm giving it to you to watch. God gives it to us to watch. Lasot ba ritzon mafkid, right? I take this item and I give it to you and I say, I want you to do with it what I want. You should do with it what I want you to do with it. And that's what God does when he gives us money. And what is God's will? V'zeritzono sheyichalek la'aniyim mimenu. That God's will is for us to disperse it and disseminate it to the poor. So that concept that it really belongs to God and therefore we have to do what God wants with our money, it exists, but very, very much on the periphery. We find very little of this. It's a strand of thought, but a limited one. Really, what we find mostly is an expression that man should have a profound impact on the material world, and which manifests itself in different sorts of property rights. Also rooted, similar to Christianity, also rooted in the idea that mankind is created in God's image, but a diametrically opposite view of what that means. According to Christianity, because we are a semblance of the divine, that means we have to be like God. And to be like God, it means to not be overtly physical, right? That's what Christianity believed, right? In other words, mankind being created in God's image, the purpose of ownership, that diminishes man's role in the physical world. The purpose of ownership in Judaism is not use, as it was for Christianity. The purpose of ownership in Judaism is dominion, to dominate, to have dominion over things, right? That in and of itself, to have dominion over things, is an expression of being created in God's image. Humankind is created in God's image, and since humankind is created in God's image, this elevates his existence, not diminishes it, and being a unique combination of the human and the divine doesn't mean that we should cut ourselves off from the world, but actually quite the contrary. What it means is we should realize that our place is here. We are here. Our place is here, and our responsibility is to elevate the material world to a higher level. And this dominion finds expression in a bunch of different ways, right, in Judaism. This dominion finds expression, first of all, in the commandment, the responsibility that we have to enjoy the good of creation. We have a responsibility to enjoy the physical world. Man is entitled, perhaps even obligated, to benefit from this world. And by benefiting from the world, we infuse it with spiritual content. So if you look at source number 5, we see something remarkable. The Gemara in Brachot tells us, Ra'a briot tovot v'ilanot tovot. If you see beautiful creatures, beautiful trees, what do? Do you suppress that feeling? Do you suppress that emotion? Do you run away from it? No. What do? You say a bracha. What bracha do you say? Omer Baruch shekacha lo ba'olamo. Blessed is he who has such a thing in his world. You make a bracha on beautiful things. We embrace beauty. We embrace the physical pleasures that this world has to offer. So much so, there's another comment of the Talmud elsewhere that says, a man or a woman is destined to give a reckoning on physical opportunities to enjoy the physical pleasures of this world that was presented to him or her, and they did not take advantage of it. If you are presented with the opportunity to take advantage of the physical pleasures of the world and you do not do so, atil litain din v'cheshbon, you are actually going to have to give a reckoning on that. So Judaism believes, obviously done so in a moderate way and in a responsible way, but to benefit from the physical world is something that we very much embrace. So first of all, our dominion over the physical world is expressed in our responsibility to enjoy the physical world. Secondly, our dominion over the physical world is expressed in our responsibility to protect the physical world, right? Because we have a responsibility to have dominance, if you will, over the physical world and to channel it for greater spiritual use. Because that's the case, we have to guard it. Like God comes to Adam and Eve and says, "La'ovda u'lishomra." You have a responsibility to till the land, to work it, and to keep it, to watch over it. There's a dominion that we have over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky. Man's authority over the creatures of the world, of the creatures of creation, is unequivocal. Mankind is at the top of the food chain, if you will, but we have to act responsibly because we are in tune with the physical world rather than repressing or suppressing the physical world. Because we embrace it, because we are in tune with it, that heightens our responsibility towards it, to maintain it, to cultivate it, to grow it, to guard it, to keep it, and to protect it. That's what we have a responsibility to do because of that fact.
That's capitalism. That's investing what we have, guarding it, wanting it to multiply.
Sure. Right. I guess yes.
It's not the natural law.
Right. Absolutely. I'm talking. For some reason, when I'm saying this, I'm talking about it in terms of like the environment. But you're right. It's not just that. It's everything physical. We have a responsibility to guard after our things because that's the case. So that in those two ways, to enjoy it, to guard it, and I think man's dominance and dominion over the world is most expressed in not in our enjoyment of creation or protection of it, but in man's capacity as a creator. Be involved in the world and perfect it through creative acts. Rav Soloveitchik writes a lot about this in The Lonely Man of Faith. He talks about there are two Adams. Every person is made up of two personas, Adam 1 and Adam 2. Because there are two descriptions of creation. We're not going to get into the details right now, but basically, part of the responsibility of mankind is to conquer, to advance, to dominate, and to create. Be involved in the world and perfect it through being creative. Man's creative development of the world is the ultimate expression of his unique status. So much so that if you take a look at source number 6, this is one of my favorite midrashim you'll find. The translation got pushed to the other side, so you can take a look at the English or the Hebrew. But basically, the following: Philosophus echad sha'alat Rabbi Hoshea. This Roman philosopher asked Rabbi Hoshea, Omar le, he said to him, Im chaviva hi hamilah. If circumcision, brit milah, is such a great thing, this philosopher asked, Mipnei ma lo natna la adam harishon. Why was man not created circumcised, and why wasn't the commandment given to Adam? Right? Amar le. So Rabbi Hoshea responded, Kol ma shenivra b'sheish yemei breshit tzrichin asiyah. Every single thing that was created in the 6 days of creation requires doing, requires perfecting. Kigon hachardal tzarich limtok. Mustard seed. You can't eat raw mustard seed. You got to sweeten it a little bit. Hatormusim tzarich limtok. Hachitim tzrichim lihitachen. You have to grind the wheat. You can't just pick wheat out of the ground and it's good to go. You got to do something with it. Afilu adam tzarich tikun. Even a person requires perfecting, requires fixing, requires improvement. Right? So the role of man in the world is to perfect the world, perfect the physical world. We become partners with God in creation. And therefore we are in tune with the physical world. We embrace the physical world perhaps in ways that we otherwise wouldn't. So man's role, having been created in God's image, is to have dominion over the world, which expresses itself, which we write to summarize what we've said up until this point. According to the Jewish view, man's role is to have dominion over the material world, which expresses itself in three ways: to enjoy the world, to protect the world, and to engage in acts of creation, to perfect the world through creative acts. Which brings us to our topic of the day, which is private property. It follows, it obviously makes sense. Everything okay?
Okay?
Okay. It follows that a Jewish society is one which is conducive to achieving these goals. The goals of actualizing our Tselem Elokim, the image of God. Perhaps the most important legal institution in this regard. What best allows us to achieve these goals. What forms the very foundation of society from a Jewish perspective is the institution of private property, right? The idea that I have stuff, which is mine. As opposed to Christianity, the right of private property in Judaism is virtually absolute.
And isn't also law necessary?
Absolutely, law is necessary. Absolutely, because we need to rein it in a little bit. We're going to get to that in just a minute. It's virtually absolute, private property. You do not find normatively, legally, that private property is at all restricted in any way. Only in the most extreme circumstances would you find that the authorities come in and take what belongs to you, right? It's almost never done. And in accordance with man's role in the world, it's only through the protection of individual property that man will be able to actualize this divine image and act as a full partner of creation in a way that makes sense. So that property, as understood as full dominion over an object, if property really is a full dominion over an object, it is a central, like you were saying, it is a central pillar of Jewish law. It's remarkable how many laws in the Torah, forget about rabbinic law, how many laws in the Torah are based solely and merely on the concept of protecting someone's property. The protection of property in the Torah is a recurring theme over and over and over again. I put some sources on the page for you to see this. Just laws which say what's yours is yours, what's mine is not. That doesn't mean we can't share together, right? Of course we should share. But the idea that what belongs to you, and that never, chas v'shalom, never in the name of a loftier purpose can I ever go in and take what's yours. So let's see. Sources number 7, 8, and 9. Just very quickly, we'll run through them. Okay? But the Gemara and the Torah in source number 7 teaches us, Lo tasig gvul re'acha asher gavlu rishonim. Right? You made what is known as the prohibition of hasagat gvul. You're not allowed to move the landmark, the property boundary that was put up by your friend. So if I live here on Riverdale Avenue and I have a fence up on my property, I'm not allowed, if I live next door, to pick up the fence, move it over a few feet so that my property is bigger and their property is smaller. That's a prohibition in the Torah. Okay? So when you do your, what are those things called, where you evaluate? Survey. When you're surveying the property, it's important to know where your property ends. I'm not allowed to build my shed in an area that impinges or encroaches on someone else's property. This is a Isser Doraisa. No worse than eating a pork sandwich. Okay? Hasagas gvul. You're not allowed to you're not allowed to take someone else's property. Okay?
And actually that's why we have surveys, because it is easy enough to move a landmark. But with a survey, you actually are measuring where this property exists on the globe in terms of latitude and longitude.
Right, exactly.
So you could be moving that fence all you want, maybe. You got to be so many degrees, so many minutes here, so many degrees, so many minutes there.
Absolutely,
That's it.
absolutely. It really helped. It's true. It really does help us. So that's point one. So I would say prohibition against stealing land. Right? Why am I prohibited to steal? The concept there would be a prohibition against stealing land only makes sense if we believe in the notion of absolute ownership. Right? Why can't I take what's yours if it really belongs to God? You should know there are some religions believe that. Hinduism, for example, we're not here to study comparative religion, but just so you know, there is no prohibition of theft in Hinduism because everything doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to whatever. Okay? I'm not an expert. But I do recall reading that. So, okay, so there's that. The second piece, right? Look at source number 8, right? Lo yiyeh lecha bekischa even ve'even gedola uktana. you may not have in your bag different weights, big and small. Okay? You may not have in your home different measures, big and small. Okay? Rather, what should you have? Verse 15. Even shleima v'tzedek yelach. Efa shleima v'tzedek yelach. You should have an even shleima v'tzedek and an efa shleima v'tzedek. Accurate and precise weights and measures. So that you can lengthen your days, to have accurate weights and measures. Why? Ki toavat Hashem Elokecha kol oseh eleh, kol oseh avel. It is a toeva of Hashem. For anyone who does, what does the word toeva mean? Usually interpreted as abomination. I would argue that it's an inaccurate translation. That's perhaps for another discussion, but which is why I didn't translate it on the page. I just wrote the word toeva. Be that as it may, it's certainly not a good thing. Okay,
What would you translate it as?
Something more along the lines of you're doing something which is unnatural.
Unnatural.
I think it explains a lot of different things, but not for now. Okay. So ki to'avat Hashem Elokecha kol oseh eleh. Why is it an abomination, for lack of a better translation, just for argument's sake? Why is it an abomination to God when I have inaccurate weights and measures?
You are taking from somebody else.
So what? I'm stealing from you. What is that? Why is that an abomination to God?
Because my ability to have, enjoy, protect, and exercise dominion over the stuff that I have is reflective of my role.
Because the property that you own is inherently a manifestation of actualizing your divine image, right? When I take from you, I am diminishing the Tselem Elokim that is within you. Because it's not just that I'm stealing and I'm a jerk. It's not just that, although that too, right? It's that when you don't have what you rightfully have earned, it hinders, it undermines your ability to actualize your Tselem Elokim. Therefore, it is a toavat Hashem. It is a perversion of your divine image when that happens. So you have to have accurate weights and measures. You may not acquire property, things, stuff, through fraud, right? For that reason, okay? And finally, 3. The mitzvah, which we're perhaps more familiar with, right? In case, even if we're not, we know the Uncle Moshe song, which is the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, okay? In source number 9, Lo tiret shor achicha o et seyo nidachim v'italamta mehem hashev tishivim la'achicha. You may not, there's a prohibition to see an item that belongs to someone else and turn your eyes away. We kind of have this like knee-jerk reaction, like instinctively we think that like returning a lost object is like a nice thing. I'm like a good Samaritan if I do that. It's a mitzvah, it's a requirement, right? No different from eating matzah on Pesach. If you see a lost item, right? If you see a lost item and you turn your eyes away, you are violating a prohibition. Lo tuchal hit aleim. You are not allowed to turn your eyes away. Okay? Hashev tishivim la'achicha. There's a mitzvah to return. Why is there a mitzvah to return a lost object to a person who owns it? Who cares? I got what I got, and I'm just going to go on my way. Like, for the same reason, because the Tselem Elokim within me and within you, in order to be fully actualized, requires the absolute validation and embracing of private property, right? You can do what you can do when you have what belongs to you, right? You are who you are, and you are able to tap into that Tselem Elokim when you have what belongs to you. So, by decrying as criminal, even as a toeva, right? By decrying as a toeva and as criminal anything that results in the loss of other people's property, the Torah is overtly, directly emphasizing the importance of property, right? This, by the way, is most exhibited by the 10th of the 10 Commandments, right? Which in and of itself, we could ask, why is that even in the... If you woke me up in the middle of the night and you asked me, instinctively on the top of your head, give me like the 10 most important mitzvot, right? So there's definitely a bunch of candidates, but I think the first 9 are worthy candidates. I could explain to you why the first 9 are on that list, right? I would be hard-pressed to explain to you why the prohibition against coveting that which belongs to others is in the list of the 10 Commandments. That makes no sense. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't kill, honor your parents, keep Shabbos. Like, I could explain all those things. I can't explain why one of the 10 Commandments is don't covet, unless I can. Because the reason why I can is how central the notion of property, of private property, of absolute private property as a manifestation and actualization of the divine image really is. And that's why it's the 10th. It's the capstone, the culmination of the 10 Commandments. Because it is the truest form of an understanding and an appreciation that what belongs to you is the actualization of your Tzelem Elokim. Also, by the way, then there are countless examples of this throughout Tanakh. So when Achav, the king of Yehuda, in Sefer Melachim, we might be familiar with the character Achav. There's this gentleman named Navot who has a field, a vineyard, and Achav wants it. So Achav kills him to take his field. And Achav later meets his demise, and the Navi says that he's killed not because of all of his averos. He lied and he cheated and he killed people, right? The reason why he's killed, the Navi says, is because of this action. Because he stole from Navot. He took from Navot. He took his property. That's why theft is such a big thing, right? It's a big thing for that reason. We also see, by the way, the importance of property rights. And again, if we had more time, we would develop this at greater length. But the idea that in halacha, property rights and the societal obligation to uphold those property rights, how important they are, we see that from the difficulty with which ownership is uprooted, right? Right. Let's say you have that phone, and I want that phone. We can't just telepathically decide, oh, that phone's going to belong to me. We actually have to concretely do something. We have to do a physical transaction through money, through signing a document, through my displaying physical ownership over it, through a meeting of the minds, yes, but also an actualization of the meaning of the minds. Because it signifies new ownership. When someone takes new ownership over something, that is a transcendent act. It's not a mundane, nothing sort of thing. The world, like the metaphysical world, is actually changing to a certain extent when that happens. Because the Tzelem Elokim quotient in the world is actually being changed. I'm getting something that didn't belong to me, and now it is. It's actually something which is much deeper, much more profound than simply my going into the store, dropping a couple coins on the counter and taking whatever it is, my candy bar, right? It's every kinyan is a transcendent act, according to this idea. Every transaction is actually transcendent. Judaism's affirmation of ownership does not end, however, with the protection of private property, but it extends as well to the accumulation of wealth. We don't believe in dependence on others, right? There is the concept of tzedakah. Tzedakah is a last resort. It's remarkable, and I can only put so many sources on the page, but I commend your attention to the many sources throughout the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrashim, which decry poverty. Poverty is not something that we embrace. We don't like being poor, right? We're actually told, stay away from poverty as much as you can. Rabbi Akiva tells his students, his son or his students in the Midrash, he says to them in Shemot Rabbah, he says, better to violate Shabbos than to become poor. It's like a remarkable thing. Now, I wouldn't say that's a normative statement. Like we wouldn't actually do that, but it's a fascinating comment, and that's really what that's kind of the added yes.
In a sense, equality and liberty, which is what we look for in
Right.
America, are opposite. I mean, you can't have complete equality and complete liberty. And the changing of possessions and giving people things that they didn't earn or have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the notions of equality and liberty to some extent are counter one to the other,
Yes.
which is why the equality that is guaranteed in our founding documents is not equality, it's the pursuit of happiness, right?
If it's equality before the law, or for court, but it's not equality of possessions.
Right, exactly.
It's equality of opportunity.
Opportunity,
There
right.
are different kinds of equality.
Absolutely.
But equality of physical things,
Is not.
And in light of this,
and
yeah,
I mean, that leads to a lot of
Absolutely.
problems in government.
absolutely. In light of this, we shouldn't be surprised that the sages, kimat b'charamachta, in one voice, in one breath, extol the virtues of work, of achieving your living through work, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for people who are supported by the community who study Torah, but the baseline is that we don't take handouts. We're not into that, right? Rabbi Akiva said, better to violate Shabbos than to take handouts, than to be supported and sustained through tzedakah. The Torah does not, right? In perhaps the greatest affirmation of this, the Gemara says, "Ani chashuv k'meis." A poor person, to some extent, is akin to a dead person, right? Now, we don't again, that's not a literal statement, but it's symbolic of this notion that poverty is not something we embrace. We're not, right? We don't like, yeah.
Well, one thought I have about that is that
Okay.
the person who is very lacking in any material possessions
Yep.
is unable to exercise dominion because the range in which they could exercise dominion is so limited.
Sure.
And so it's very, very undesirable for any human being, especially any Jewish human being, to be in that predicament.
Absolutely, because they,
In fact, when you give tzedakah to someone, you're supposed to give them sufficient amount so that they themselves will have an excess beyond
Sure.
their absolute needs, that they themselves can give tzedakah. You wonder, wow, what's that about? It's so that they can exercise what they're supposed to be doing in this world.
sure. And we're going to conclude with that in just a moment. So we decry dependence on others. That's not something that we like. We would go through more sources about that. But so what we've done so far is we've shown how Judaism embraces private property. Judaism embraces, or at least validates, accumulation of wealth. The more I have, the more I'm able to actualize my Tzelem Elokim, right? So where does charity fit in all of this? The Torah says that lo yachdal avyon mikaraf haaretz, that when commanding us to give tzedakah, the Torah says there will always be poor people among you. It's like, what does that mean? Like, what exactly does that charge us to do? So, in fact, there are codified laws that say, like, we actually have the opposite, right? Whereas in some societies, like, they take everything you have, except for the bare minimum, and give to the poor. There are actually laws on the books in Judaism that say, don't give too much to the poor, because you might become poor yourself, right? Don't give too much. Give what you can, but no more than a fifth. That's one of the numbers that's out there. Okay, so as not to become poor yourself. When it says ki lo yachdal avyon mikarav haaretz, why not? What is that? When it says that there will never be poor, that poor people will never cease to exist. When it says that, what does that mean, right?
We're not going to have redistribution.
So why not? Why will poor people never cease to exist? So I would suggest this is not a commentary. This is a value statement. It's not a practical assurance that poor people always, it's a value statement, a fundamental one. Economic disparity does not demonstrate the moral corruption of society, which is what socialistic strands of thought try to say. When there is income inequality, it means that society is corrupt, right? That's what people say. It doesn't mean that society is corrupt, but it's a fundamental difference. There are rather fundamental differences in terms of the individuals who comprise society. Lo yachdal avyon mikarav haaretz means not that society is corrupt, but that you will always have the obligation to sustain, to protect, and to take care of those less fortunate amongst us, right? So, according to halacha, the notion of charity that exists is not a it's not a, the sages define charity not as a juridical principle, as one which is meant to achieve justice, okay? But the sages define charity as something which is a moral principle, right? A responsibility to look out for our fellow man, especially those in need, right? Therefore, in Judaism, the focus of charity, as you said, the focus of charity really is not on the recipient. The focus is always on the donor. Always. The focus is on the donor. It aims to cultivate a sense of responsibility as a moral and a religious obligation. When there is someone who needs my help, I have to help them. I don't give charity to level the playing field. I give charity because I have a responsibility towards those less fortunate amongst us. Ki lo yachdal avyon mikarav haaretz, right? There will always be this responsibility. There will always be this obligation. For this reason, the laws of charity are a remark. The laws of charity tell us aniyeh ircha kodmin. If I have a poor person who lives next door and a poor person who lives in Europe, do I have a responsibility towards one over the other? Says the halacha, aniyeh ircha kodmin. The poor people in your city come first. Now, if tzedakah was all about economic justice, about leveling the playing field, that notion makes no sense, right? Why is the poor person who lives next door to me any more important to me in terms of leveling the playing field than a poor person who lives in Zimbabwe, right? But if it's not about economic justice, if tzedakah is about a moral responsibility, a religious responsibility that I have to better the lives of those less fortunate, then of course I am going to first have a responsibility to take care of the people that are in my environment, that are in my surroundings. That makes perfect sense. I have a moral responsibility towards my family. There are concentric circles. I have a moral responsibility first to my family, then to my close friends, then to my community, then to my neighborhood, right? And then, at the end of the day, maybe to the people in Zimbabwe, but not before that, right? In fact, so much so, we'll end with this point and then segue into what our discussion is going to be next week. The legal codes, every legal code, we didn't get back to the tour, but every legal code, every Jewish halachic legal code that's been written, places the laws of tzedakah not with other monetary laws, like the laws of damages and the laws of torts and the laws of theft and the laws of proper. None of that. The laws of tzedakah are always placed with other ritual religious laws, right? So it's in Yoredeya, right? Yoredeya is the section of the laws that deal with ritual issues, keeping kosher, putting up a mezuzah, a bris milah, hilchot avelut, mourning, all that stuff, and tzedakah. Because tzedakah is a moral, religious obligation, not a juridical one, not one which is meant to achieve justice. And we'll end by making this point, and we'll segue to next week. People who claim that Judaism advocates a system of distributive justice very often point to the notion that already in Mishnaic times there existed this concept of a gabbai tzedakah, right? Someone who would come in and coerce, compel you to give the tzedakah that you were supposed to give. But that's really an incorrect reading. Socialism is about redistributing excess wealth in order to limit the economic gaps, leading towards an ideal of economic equality. In rabbinic sources, that's not there. This type of coercion doesn't exist. What does exist, it's not a coercion of distribution and a coercion of justice, but as a way of enforcing a minimum baseline level of moral competence and religious rectitude. You have to be a good person. That's why I'm making you give tzedakah, not because that person needs it, as much as you have to be a part of society. You have to be a good person, a moral person. It's a moral corrective, not an economic one. Tzedakah is as much about morality as it is about economics. Not justice, but virtue. Not to limit one's wealth, but to create personal responsibility and accountability. Which leads us to what we're going to discuss next week, which is what role does the concept of social welfare, taxation, distribution, what role does that play in a halachic society? Given this notion of tselem Elokim, that I'm actualizing my divine that's within me, what does it mean to take from one and give to the other? Social welfare programs, do we believe in those things? If so, how? How do they work? How do we implement them? That we're, God willing, going to discuss next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Very well done. Thank you.
Thank you.